Russian President Vladimir Putin, during a diplomatic ceremony at Arlington, ordered the tomb guard to step aside so his security detail could secure the area. The demand violated every protocol, every tradition, every sacred rule that governed this hallowed ground. The crowd held its breath. Before we reveal the exact words that stopped Putin cold, and why this tomb guard's response became legendary in military circles worldwide, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If stories of courage, honor, and unwavering dedication inspire you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story of American heroes standing firm against impossible odds. The morning sun cast long shadows across Arlington National Cemetery, touching thousands of white headstones that stretched across the rolling Virginia hills like sentinels themselves. At the heart of this sacred ground stood the tomb of the unknown soldier, a masterpiece of white marble that had become America's most hallowed military shrine. For 90 years, through world wars and cold wars, through national triumphs and tragedies, through scorching summers and brutal winters, the tomb guards had maintained their watch without interruption. 21 steps. Turn, pause for 21 seconds. Turn again. The rhythm was as eternal as the sacrifice it honored. Sergeant Michael Stone had walked this route thousands of times over his 3 years as a sentinel. At 32, he was one of the senior members of the elite Old Guard, the unit responsible for guarding the tomb and conducting military ceremonies at Arlington. His selection as a tomb guard had been the pinnacle of his military career, the result of months of intensive training where every movement was scrutinized, every uniform detail inspected, every breath measured. Only the most dedicated soldiers earned the right to walk these 21 steps, and Stone wore that honor like invisible armor beneath his immaculate uniform. His ceremonial dress uniform was pressed to perfection, the dark blue wool bearing the distinctive red stripe that marked him as a member of the 3rd United States Infantry Regiment. White gloves covered his hands, spotless despite the summer humidity. His shoes were polished to mirror brightness, reflecting the morning sun with each measured step. The M14 rifle he carried gleamed with the same meticulous care, its every surface treated with the reverence due to an instrument of sacred duty rather than merely a weapon. The day had started like any other, but whispers had been spreading through Arlington's administrative offices since dawn. A state visit was scheduled, something that happened occasionally but always brought extra scrutiny and heightened security. What made this visit different, what had caused tension among the cemetery's staff and military personnel, was the identity of the foreign dignitary. Russian President Vladimir Putin would be paying respects at the tomb of the unknown soldier as part of a diplomatic mission to Washington. The political implications were enormous. Relations between the United States and Russia had been strained for years, marked by proxy conflicts, cyber warfare accusations, and competing interests across the globe. Putin's visit to Arlington was meant to be a gesture of respect, a moment where geopolitical tensions could be set aside in recognition of shared military sacrifice. World War II had seen American and Soviet forces fighting as allies against Nazi Germany, and the tomb represented all those who had died in that conflict and others. But politics and protocol rarely mix smoothly, and the arrangements for Putin's visit had been fraught with complications from the start. The Russian delegation had made numerous demands about security procedures, photography restrictions, and ceremony modifications. Most had been accommodated through careful diplomatic negotiation, with both sides making compromises to ensure the visit could proceed smoothly. However, one demand had been categorically refused by Arlington's officials and the Department of Defense, a demand that struck at the very heart of what the tomb represented. Stone had been briefed about the potential for complications, but his orders remained unchanged. Maintain the watch, honor the fallen, protect the dignity of the tomb. These were not negotiable principles, not subject to diplomatic considerations or political expediency. The unknown soldiers who rested beneath the marble had given everything for their country, and the sentinel's duty was to ensure their sacrifice was honored with unwavering dedication, regardless of who was visiting or what pressures might be applied. As the morning progressed, black SUVs began arriving at Arlington's main entrance. Security personnel in dark suits with earpieces spread throughout the cemetery, their presence a stark contrast to the usual peaceful atmosphere. News crews set up cameras at designated positions, kept at a respectful distance but eager to capture footage of this unusual diplomatic moment. Diplomats and military attachés from both nations gathered near the tomb, their conversations quiet but intense as final preparations were made. Stone maintained his routine, his focus unwavering despite the growing crowd and obvious tension. Each step was placed with precision, his body moving with the mechanical perfection that came from thousands of hours of practice. His face remained impassive, a mask of professional composure that revealed nothing of his thoughts or awareness of the unfolding situation. To observers, he appeared almost inhuman, a living statue whose dedication transcended normal human concerns. The presidential motorcade arrived with the quiet efficiency of a well-rehearsed operation. More SUVs, more security personnel, and finally the distinctive figure of Vladimir Putin emerging from an armored vehicle. He was shorter than many expected, but his presence commanded attention nonetheless. Dressed in a dark suit with minimal decoration, he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to power and deference. His security detail surrounded him immediately, hard-eyed men who scanned the area with professional paranoia. The formal ceremony began with speeches from American military officials and Russian diplomats, each carefully worded to acknowledge the historical alliance while avoiding current tensions. A wreath was prepared for Putin to lay at the tomb, a gesture of respect that had been made by countless world leaders over the decades. The crowd of observers maintained respectful silence, aware they were witnessing a moment that transcended the individuals involved. But as Putin's group began moving toward the tomb itself, the careful choreography that had been planned began to unravel. The Russian security detail, accustomed to controlling every aspect of their president's movements, suddenly balked at the presence of an armed American soldier standing directly in the path their principal would take. To them, Stone represented an uncontrolled variable, a potential threat that their protocols demanded be neutralized or removed. The head of Putin's security team, a thick-necked man whose suit barely contained his muscular frame, stepped forward with the aggressive confidence of someone used to getting his way through intimidation. He approached the rope barrier that separated visitors from the sentinels' post, his eyes locked on Stone with the calculating assessment of a predator evaluating potential prey. Behind him, other security personnel shifted position, creating a wall of human intimidation that had cleared paths in countless other countries. What they didn't understand, what their briefings had apparently failed to convey, was that the tomb guard doesn't move for anyone. The Russian security chief spoke first to an American protocol officer standing nearby, his English heavily accented but perfectly clear. His demand was simple and, from his perspective, entirely reasonable. The armed American soldier needed to step aside temporarily while President Putin approached the tomb. It was standard security procedure, he explained, his tone suggesting this was a minor formality that any reasonable person would immediately accommodate. The American protocol officer, a career diplomat named Margaret Chen who had coordinated hundreds of international visits, felt her stomach drop. She had warned her Russian counterparts repeatedly during the planning phase that this request would be impossible to fulfill. The Sentinels' watch was unbroken and unbreakable, a tradition maintained through weather emergencies, security threats, and even during the hours after the September 11th attacks, when most of Washington was evacuated. The tomb guard simply did not leave his post, did not interrupt his routine, and did not acknowledge demands or requests from visitors, regardless of their rank or importance. Chen approached the Russian security chief with diplomatic courtesy masking her rising alarm. She explained again, carefully and respectfully, that the sentinel could not be moved or have his routine interrupted. It was not a matter of unwillingness, but of sacred military tradition that transcended diplomatic protocol. The tomb guard's duty was to the fallen soldiers resting beneath the marble, not to visiting dignitaries, no matter how powerful. She suggested alternative arrangements that would allow Putin to lay his wreath while respecting the sentinel's watch. The security chief's expression hardened. He was not accustomed to having his security requirements negotiated or refused. In dozens of countries, his word regarding presidential security was essentially law, with local authorities bending over backward to accommodate Russian demands. The idea that some ceremonial guard's routine was more important than the president's safety struck him as absurd, a foolish adherence to meaningless tradition that endangered his principle. Behind him, Putin himself had been briefed on the situation and was now watching the exchange with the cold, analytical gaze that had characterized his rise to power. He had dealt with American stubbornness before, had navigated countless international confrontations where will and resolve mattered more than formal power. This moment, seemingly minor in the grand scheme of geopolitics, had taken on symbolic weight. Would the Americans bend to accommodate his visit, or would they hold firm to their traditions even at the risk of diplomatic embarrassment? The crowd of observers had grown quiet, sensing that the ceremony was not proceeding as planned. News cameras zoomed in on the cluster of officials engaged in intense conversation near the rope barrier. Military personnel from both nations watched with professional interest, each understanding that something significant was unfolding beyond the surface diplomatic niceties. The Russian security chief made a decision. Rather than continuing to negotiate with intermediate officials, he would address the source of the problem directly. He stepped over the rope barrier, an action that immediately brought American security personnel to high alert, and walked purposefully toward Sergeant Michael Stone. The sentinel was mid-step in his routine, his attention apparently focused on some distant point beyond the marble tomb. Seemingly unaware of the approaching confrontation, Stone had, of course, been tracking every movement in his peripheral vision. His training included awareness of potential threats and disruptions, and the Russian security team's agitation had been obvious for several minutes. But his face betrayed nothing, his step never faltering, his focus remaining locked on his duty. The 21 steps were completed, the ceremonial turn executed with precision. The 21-second pause begun with the same unwavering discipline that had marked every previous cycle. The Russian security chief positioned himself directly in Stone's line of march, close enough that the next sequence of steps would bring them face to face. It was an aggressive move, a physical challenge designed to force a response. His posture was confrontational, his considerable bulk intended to intimidate, his expression making clear that he expected immediate compliance with his unspoken demand. Stone's 21-second pause ended. Without acknowledging the man standing in his path, without any change in expression or rhythm, the sentinel began his next sequence of 21 steps. His first step brought him within inches of the Russian security chief, but Stone's gaze remained fixed ahead, his movement steady and unhurried. The message was clear without a word being spoken. The routine would continue, and obstacles would be navigated around or, if necessary, through. The security chief held his ground for 3 more steps, then was forced to move aside, as Stone's unwavering advance made collision inevitable. The sentinel adjusted his path by mere inches, enough to avoid physical contact, but not enough to suggest deviation from his prescribed route. It was a masterclass in military bearing, a demonstration that discipline and dedication could be more powerful than physical intimidation. Frustrated and somewhat embarrassed by this silent rebuke, the Russian security chief made a critical error in judgment. He reached out to grab Stone's arm, intending to physically halt the sentinel's movement and force the confrontation he seemed incapable of avoiding through mere presence. His hand closed around the sleeve of Stone's immaculate uniform, and for a moment, everything at Arlington National Cemetery seemed to freeze. What happened next would be debated in military academies and diplomatic circles for years to come. Stone completed his current step, planting his foot with the same precision as every step before it. Then, in a movement so smooth it seemed choreographed, he executed a facing movement that brought him eye to eye with the Russian security chief. His rifle remained at ceremonial carry, his posture perfect, but his voice when he spoke carried the weight of 9 decades of unbroken tradition and the authority of every soldier who had ever walked this post. The words he spoke were not shouted or dramatic. They were delivered in the measured, professional tone of someone stating incontrovertible fact. But those words cut through the tension like a blade, silencing every conversation, stopping every movement, and forcing even Vladimir Putin himself to pause and reconsider the situation unfolding before him. The plaza that had been filled with diplomatic murmurs and security chatter fell absolutely silent. Stone's voice carried across the plaza with crystal clarity, each word precisely enunciated. His statement was not a request, not a suggestion, and certainly not open to negotiation. It was a declaration of absolute truth, delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who knows beyond any doubt that he occupies the moral and traditional high ground. The exact words would be replayed on news broadcasts around the world within hours, but their impact was immediate and profound. He informed the Russian security chief that he was interfering with official duties at a United States military installation. He explained that the Sentinels' watch had continued unbroken for 90 years through every conceivable crisis and emergency, and it would not be interrupted today for security theater or diplomatic convenience. He noted that the tomb of the unknown soldier was not merely a monument, but a sacred trust, and that trust superseded the comfort or preferences of any visiting dignitary, regardless of their position or power. Then came the statement that would define the moment, the words that would be quoted in military tradition for generations. Stone looked directly at the security chief and stated with absolute calm that if interference with his duty continued, he was authorized and prepared to use any force necessary to maintain the security and dignity of the tomb. This was not a threat in the aggressive sense, but rather a statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of someone describing gravity or sunrise. The Sentinel's duty included protecting the tomb from all disturbances, and that authority came from the highest levels of American military command. The Russian security chief released Stone's arm as if it had suddenly become heated. His face flushed with a combination of embarrassment and anger, but he also recognized that he had miscalculated badly. This was not some ceremonial guard who could be bullied or intimidated into abandoning his post. This was a soldier executing his duty with a dedication that made compromise impossible and negotiation meaningless. Stone completed his facing movement and resumed his march without waiting for a response. 21 more steps, the rhythm never broken. The composure never cracked. The brief verbal exchange had taken perhaps 15 seconds, but it had fundamentally altered the dynamics of the entire diplomatic visit. The message sent was unmistakable. American military traditions were not subject to negotiation, and the sacred duties of the armed forces would not be subordinated to political convenience. Vladimir Putin had watched the entire exchange from his position near the wreath presentation area. His expression was difficult to read, that practiced neutrality that had served him through decades of political confrontation. But those who knew him well noticed a subtle shift in his demeanor, a slight tightening around the eyes that suggested either respect or recalculation. He spoke quietly to his security chief, who approached him looking distinctly uncomfortable, and a brief conversation ensued that was not captured by microphones or lip readers. The Russian president made a gesture that would surprise many observers. Rather than escalating the confrontation or demanding that his security requirements be met, he nodded in what appeared to be acknowledgement or even approval. He turned to Margaret Chen and indicated through an interpreter that he understood the situation and would proceed with the wreath-laying ceremony without any modifications to the Sentinel's routine. It was, in its way, a concession that carried its own message. Some traditions commanded respect, even from those who typically demanded deference. The ceremony continued with careful choreography that navigated around Stone's uninterrupted watch. Putin laid his wreath at a moment when the Sentinel's routine brought him to the far end of his march, maximizing distance while preserving the dignity of both the Russian president and the American tradition. Photographs were taken at carefully selected angles that captured Putin's gesture of respect, while also showing the tomb guard, maintaining his eternal watch in the background. The American military officials felt a collective release of tension they hadn't realized they'd been holding. The potential for international incident had been enormous. If Stone had been forced from his post, or if the confrontation had escalated to physical conflict, the diplomatic fallout would have been severe. Instead, the tomb guard's unwavering commitment to duty had transformed a potential crisis into a demonstration of principle that even potential adversaries could recognize and respect. News of the confrontation spread through unofficial channels even before the ceremony concluded. Military personnel at Arlington who had witnessed the exchange texted friends and colleagues. Security staff shared accounts with their counterparts. By the time Putin's motorcade departed Arlington, the story was already circulating through military communities worldwide, being shared with the mixture of pride and satisfaction that accompanies tales of backbone displayed under pressure. Stone, of course, was unaware of the growing legend surrounding his brief statement. His focus remained entirely on his duty, the 21 steps that continued regardless of what drama had unfolded around them. He had simply done what every tomb guard is trained to do: protect the dignity of the fallen and maintain the sacred watch without deviation or compromise. That his duty had required confronting one of the world's most powerful leaders was merely circumstance, not something that merited special consideration or changed the fundamental nature of his obligation. The international media response was immediate and divided along predictable geopolitical lines. American news outlets celebrated the tomb guard's dedication and the symbolic victory of tradition over political pressure. Russian state media downplayed the confrontation, framing Putin's visit as a successful gesture of respect that honored shared World War II history. European and Asian news organizations analyzed the incident as revealing underlying tensions in U.S.-Russia relations and the difficulties of diplomatic protocol when cultural differences collide. But beyond the political analysis and diplomatic parsing, the story resonated with millions of people who saw in Stone's response something fundamental about dedication, duty, and the courage to stand firm when principles are tested. The image of a lone sentinel refusing to bend to power became symbolic of larger questions about integrity and the willingness to defend traditions that give meaning to sacrifice. In the hours and days following Putin's visit to Arlington, the full implications of Stone's confrontation began to emerge. What had seemed like a brief moment of tension at a diplomatic ceremony had touched nerves far beyond military tradition or U.S.-Russia relations. The story spread through social media with remarkable speed, shared and reshared by veterans, active duty military members, and civilians who found in Stone's unwavering dedication a reminder of values that seemed increasingly rare in modern public life. Military forums and veteran organizations erupted with pride and discussion. Retired tomb guards shared their own stories of maintaining the watch through challenges and disruptions. Active duty soldiers from all branches expressed solidarity with Stone's defense of military tradition. The consensus was overwhelming. The tomb guard had done exactly what his duty required, and in doing so had demonstrated why that tradition mattered so profoundly. The Pentagon initially declined to comment on the incident, citing the sensitive nature of ongoing diplomatic relations with Russia. But unofficial statements from military sources made clear that Stone had followed proper protocol and that his actions were entirely consistent with the authority granted to tomb guards to protect the dignity of their post. The Department of Defense's silence was itself a form of support, a refusal to apologize or explain away actions that required neither apology nor explanation. International reaction provided fascinating insights into how different cultures viewed military tradition and the balance between diplomatic courtesy and institutional integrity. French military officials, whose own Tomb of the Unknown Soldier at the Arc de Triomphe maintained similar traditions, expressed understanding and support for the American sentinels' position. British commentators noted parallels to the changing palace and the strict protocols that govern interactions with the Queen's Guard. Nations with strong military traditions generally sided with the view that some duties transcend diplomatic convenience. Interestingly, some Russian military voices also expressed grudging respect for Stone's dedication. Veterans of Soviet and Russian armed forces understood the significance of military discipline and the importance of honoring the fallen. While official Russian government responses were muted or critical, unofficial conversations among military personnel suggested appreciation for a soldier who took his duty seriously enough to challenge even powerful visitors. There was recognition that such dedication, while inconvenient in the moment, reflected values that any serious military organization should cultivate. The incident prompted broader discussions about the nature of military service and the role of tradition in modern armed forces. Critics argued that rigid adherence to ceremonial protocols was outdated, thinking that prioritized symbolism over practical considerations like diplomatic relations and security efficiency. They questioned whether an honor guard's routine should really supersede the security requirements of a visiting head of state. Suggesting that flexibility and pragmatism should guide such situations, defenders of the tomb guard tradition responded that such criticism fundamentally misunderstood the purpose and importance of military ceremonies. The Sentinel's watch was not merely symbolic pageantry, but a tangible manifestation of the military's commitment to never forget those who gave everything in service. To compromise that watch for diplomatic convenience would be to suggest that some sacrifices matter less than others. That tradition can be set aside when inconvenient, and that solemn commitments are negotiable based on political calculations. Stone himself became an unwitting celebrity, though he remained largely out of the public eye. Military protocol and his own preference for privacy meant he gave no interviews and made no public statements about the confrontation. His social media presence, minimal to begin with, remained unchanged. Friends and family who were contacted by reporters declined to comment or simply reiterated that he was a dedicated soldier doing his duty. This absence of self-promotion, or attempts to capitalize on his moment of fame only, enhanced his reputation among those who valued genuine dedication over performative heroism. The long-term impact on U.S.-Russia diplomatic relations was minimal, as both nations had far larger issues occupying their attention than a brief confrontation at a cemetery. Putin's visit continued through its scheduled events without further incident, and official diplomatic communications made no reference to the Arlington situation. The professional relationship between the two countries' governments continued in its established patterns of cooperation on some issues and conflict on others. But within military communities, the story of the tomb guard who faced down Putin's security team became legendary. It was told and retold in barracks and officers' clubs, shared in veteran gatherings and military history classes. Each retelling emphasized different aspects: Stone's calm professionalism, the perfect delivery of his statement, the symbolic significance of tradition standing firm against power, the universal military value of dedication to duty above personal comfort or advancement. The incident also sparked renewed interest in the tomb guard tradition itself. Applications to the old guard increased in the months following the confrontation, with young soldiers citing Stone's example as inspiration for their desire to serve at Arlington. Tourism to the tomb of the unknown soldier saw a measurable uptick as people who had heard the story wanted to witness the Sentinel's watch themselves and understand the tradition that had proven strong enough to withstand even geopolitical pressure. For Stone, life returned to its established patterns. His watch at the tomb continued with the same dedication as before. 21 steps repeated through changing seasons and varying weather, through crowds and quiet moments, through the weight of tradition and the satisfaction of duty fulfilled. He was eventually promoted and later transferred to other assignments, as all tomb guards eventually are. But his brief moment standing firm against one of the world's most powerful leaders would define how he was remembered in military history. The tomb of the unknown soldier continues its eternal watch, sentinels marching their 21 steps regardless of who visits or what pressures might be applied. The tradition that Stone defended remains unbroken, a testament to the idea that some duties transcend politics, power, and the ever-changing landscape of international relations. In a world where compromise and flexibility are often necessary, the unyielding dedication of the tomb guard serves as a reminder that some things must remain constant, that some promises must be kept without exception, and that honor sometimes requires the courage to stand absolutely still while the world demands that you move.